All right. Hi, everybody. So we are recording now. We're doing another virtual behavior chat. So with Barbara Heidenreich and Annette Pedersen. Am I saying Pedersen? I feel like there's a better, more Danish way to say Pedersen.
You can say Peterson.
Peterson.
That's
Oh,
yeah, that's pretty close.
that would make more sense, I get.
That's what
But
I hear most anyway.
So I'll allow them to talk about themselves a little bit. We might have something also in the video when this is uploaded. But Barbara does tons of stuff, has a long history with working with exotic animals. I won't go into too much detail. Barbara, I'll let you fill in some of that. And Annette works with Copenhagen Zoo. Again, it's similar, long history of doing lots and lots of amazing stuff, training all kinds of exotic animals. Another exciting thing that I'll mention, and then I guess I should say I'm Eddie, Dr. Eduardo Fernandez. I'm a senior lecturer of applied animal behavior and welfare in the School of Animal and Veterinary Sciences at University of Adelaide in Australia. Although I am not in Australia right now, I am in Seattle. So that's a whole other thing. But the only other thing I'm going to mention before letting Barbara and Annette introduce themselves here is that both Barbara and Annette will have articles coming out in an upcoming, it's looking like August, a special issue of Operance Magazine, which Operance Magazine is the official publication, non-academic publication of the B.F. Skinner Foundation. Uh, and I am the guest editor for a special issue that's dedicated to applied animal behavior work. So we have 8 articles that will come out in that special issue, and I think it will be out in August. If you go to the B.F. Skinner Foundation, you can sign up to get notifications for free from Operance Magazine, and it's free to read all of it and look at all of that too. So there's not only are there no charges for coming and hanging out with us today, or no charges for watching us on YouTube. If you're watching us on YouTube, hi YouTube people. There's also no charges for reading our stuff in whenever that is, August. So lots of free stuff. I like free. Free's awesome. Okay. Uh, Barbara, Annette, do you want to give kind of more formal? I don't normally do that formal of introductions for these, but I think it's nice if you guys can give a little description of who you are.
Sure. Yeah, and maybe what's the website again for Operance Magazine? We ought to put that out there.
Let's put that. Let me look that up.
Oh, and my dog wants to say something.
Oh, well, you have somebody saying hello there, but yeah, very good suggestion, and I'll let you keep describing yourself, Barbara.
Okay, my dog decided to be quiet. Okay. Yeah, so a lot of people on here, at least with us right now, I think already know me, but maybe there's some people that will view this later that don't. My name is Barbara Heidenreich, and I mostly do animal training consulting with zoos and universities and conservation projects. Basically, any place that we have animals in managed care. I primarily focus on exotics, but I've also got a background working with companion animals, but mostly kind of the weird things, so like parrots and rabbits and guinea pigs, stuff like that. I do, prior to the pandemic, I traveled a lot around the world. Hopefully we'll be doing that again as things loosen up a little bit. And at the moment, a lot of my energy is focused on a website I have called animaltrainingfundamentals.com, where people can learn virtually about training exotic animals. And I'm also in school right now getting my master's in behavior analysis. So that's me.
Yep.
That's a lot, Barbara. I don't have so much to say, but well, I've been working in Copenhagen for quite a while, 32 years actually, so I haven't been around much. But my career has been like, I started as a trainee and then I worked at the marine mammals section. And after 20 years with the marine mammals, I moved to the elephant section, worked with elephants, moving them from free to protected contact. And at the same time, actually, I got offered the position as an animal training coordinator for the zoo, which I've done since. So that's about 12 years or something. So I learned a lot from a lot of animals and a lot of good people, good trainers. I'm very fortunate to have a lot of good trainers at the zoo. And besides that, I teach training a bit for the Danish Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And I also act as chair for the Animal Training Working Group for IASA, which is the European Associations of Zoos and Aquariums. So I guess that's pretty much it.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's I have yet to be to Copenhagen Zoo, and I'm hoping that sometime whenever we get to the point where we can all start traveling a bit more freely, I'm hoping to be able to come out to Copenhagen Zoo and maybe be able to talk to some of you all. So that's something I very much look forward to. All the things that as we're getting closer to this light at the end of the tunnel of this pandemic, these are all lots of things to look forward to.
Look forward to that, Eddie. Absolutely.
Yeah. That's
lovely
something
to have you there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I'm sure we'll talk more about in the future as well. That's a big Copenhagen Zoo has done some phenomenal work. So, and Annetta's been fabulous with the stuff she's done out there. So, and for anybody, yeah. Well, that a great team is definitely extremely helpful. That's a nice.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So I already typed into the chat specifically Operance Magazine link there for people watching this on YouTube. I'll put this in. I'll include a link there in the channel or the video description as well. But just for anybody that's not seeing that right off the bat, you can just go to bfskinner.org. So bfskinner.org. And you should be able to find Operance Magazine, the link there for that. So simple enough. So we did have a few different talking points, general talking points, but everyone can feel free to type in any questions at any point, type into chat. One of our first talking points that we did note was talking about creating and shaping new behavior, just getting new behavior in general with animals. So for any animal training practice, I think we were talking more generally, so not specifically, not just, getting new behavior in flamingos or something like that. Annette talks a bit about flamingos. So I wore a special, in your Operance Magazine article, I wore a special flamingo shirt there for you, Annette. So, but generally talking about generating new behavior. So I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on this.
Barbara, you're up.
I'm up. Well, I think this is something that both Annette and I enjoy talking about a lot together because, again, coming from the practical application side of it, I think it's one of those things where we get to be really creative, and especially working with exotic animals, we really have to be creative because many times we have animals that, for various reasons, may not necessarily feel super comfortable close to people. We may have to look at ways that we're arranging our environment so it's easy to create action. We may have to think about the ethology of this species. What physically can the animal do? There's a lot of different factors that go into creating a situation in which you can create action so that you can reinforce it. And it's always different. So you're always getting an opportunity to challenge what you know, and something that worked with one animal may not work with another animal. And So all these things, you know, kind of pull on your experience and challenge you. And I love, I'm gonna prompt Annette here to tell the story because I thought it was such a great one, which is the one that you shared with me. We were working collaboratively on a project to train animals to allow nasal swabs or oral swabs to test for COVID-19 when it was all kind of coming out that all these different species might be susceptible to the virus. And so we created a course together on that. And so one of the animals, I trained my dog to do an open mouth behavior. And we kind of looked at that as a model for training some other animals for an oral swab and also for a nasal swab, because it was a great position that he would get into that worked for that as an example to use for other animals. And so they used that at Copenhagen Zoo to train their panda, but there were some challenges. And so I'm going to pass it over to you now to talk about what you figured out that helped you get the desired action that you needed so that you could do the behavior.
Oh, so you're talking about how we got the calm behavior? Was that the one? Or yeah.
Because he wouldn't really hold position very well, right?
Yeah, that was our female. Actually, we had a lot of success with the male. He was really easy to work with, and he picked it up really fast. And the trainer was great. And then we wanted to do it with the females because we wanted to do as many gum swabs as possible. And that was for a research project also. But when we started working with the female, we couldn't make her, you know, focus on us, and she kept moving around. We couldn't make her sit still and just relax and take in information. We had to feed her constantly. She was taught to be fed constantly to act with the trainers. And I went to see a session because the keeper came to me and said that there's no way I can get this panda to sit still. But I said, you just need about a second to reinforce, you know, there must be some times where she's just, you know, show calm behavior for just a second. And he went, and I went to look at it, and I could see he was absolutely right. As soon as she had her piece of apple, she started doing these movements with the head, and then they become more and more bigger and bigger, and she started using her arms, and you know, she was going into kind of an extinction burst. She was getting up and she grabbing out after the trainer, and it was really difficult. And I could see that there wasn't anything he could reinforce. So how could we get her just to stop for a second so we can reinforce? And what I've seen with my dog sometimes is that he comes up to my face and he's kind of sniffing close to my face. And then I, you know, just exhale a bit to him, and he just stands there sniffing. And I said to the trainer, try to just exhale, not blowing at her because animals probably don't like that, but just exhale your breath. And I have to say that for people that don't know pandas, they are very odor focused. They love new odors, anything. And if they can if you can put it on a towel or something, they will just wrap themselves in it. They just love new smells and new odors. So this trainer, he just exhaled in her direction, and suddenly she stopped because there was this new smell. And I said, oh, down, reinforce. And he could keep doing that. And actually it took just a couple of sessions before she started to show this calm behavior, and we could reinforce the behavior. And that's actually her most preferred behavior right now. So if she doesn't pick up the cue, or she get confused or something like that, she offer this calm behavior, just really staring into his eyes. So yeah. that was a surprise. It's one of the days when you go home from work and say, yay, we discovered something new. So exciting. Yeah.
Plus training pandas.
Yeah. But pandas are cute. I don't know if that's an advantage or a disadvantage for them. So
they are extremely cute. They're and also one of so we're talking about giant pandas. We should probably be clear here. So not the raccoon like red panda.
But they're
Uh,
cute too.
no, well, they're
Yeah,
beyond
they're cute
adorable.
too.
Both of them are adorable. But the reason why I like to make this distinction of giant pandas, which this is important. Now we're talking about one of the 8 bear species. And the ursids are, so this is the family of carnivora. Both red pandas and giant pandas are in carnivora order, right? But the ursids themselves, so Ursidae, the family, there's 8 species in, and I like to jokingly say that the giant pandas are the only one of the 8 species that are probably the laziest of the, as
Indeed.
they're compared to the 7 other bear species, all 7 of the other bear species. We're talking about amazing adaptive qualities, from spectacled bears in South America, dragging cattle carcasses up into the canopies of jungles, into these nests. So things that weigh more than them at times, they can drag up trees. Polar bears that can travel for days, weeks on end, just to find a ring seal potentially pup in a den 50 plus miles away, that they can smell it. This is things like Ian Sterling has reported that a polar bear can smell. Not that I have any interest in bears, by the way, but that Ian Sterling, the person who spent more time watching polar bears in the wild, it talked about smelling that a polar bear could smell a ring seal pup over 50 plus miles away under several feet of snow. So under more than a meter of snow in a ring seal pup den, right? So I did a lot of my doctoral work with polar bears. So you look at this, you look at all these adaptive qualities of these different bears, and then you get to the panda. What's the giant panda's specialty? They can digest bamboo. That's their specialty. They can sit around and eat a bunch of bamboo all day long. That's their. Although I will say some of the stuff that giant pandas do in the wild are pretty amazing, with marking territories and doing. If you haven't seen video, David Attenborough even has some stuff on giant pandas in the wild, doing these, trying to get their spray, their scent marks up as high as they can, and they are amazing climbers. But you see
Yes.
them in captivity, and you just go, what happened to you compared to the other bears? So nonetheless, this is all amazing stuff. I don't want to keep going. I don't want to make this entire chat about bears, because bears are fantastic. I've worked with half the species now. So I've worked with, I did my doctoral work with polar bears. I've published work with polar bears and grizzly bears in captivity. I want to be clear about that, because polar bears are the scariest animal on the planet, and I will demand that until my deathbed. They are the scariest animal on the planet.
I agree.
But
I agree.
And I've also worked with sun bears and sloth bears. So I have yet to work, Annette, with the giant pandas. Hopefully Adelaide Zoo has giant pandas, and I'm hoping when I get there, that's a project that, whether working with Rachel Robbins, Dr. Rachel Robbins, or Nick Bishop, or some of my colleagues there at Adelaide Zoo, that will come up with something to work with them. But I did want to come back, and I know there's a couple questions, by the way, that I wanted to point out, and I want to get to those. I did, because both of you made some really important points, and I just wanted to talk about those briefly, about getting new behavior. And this is an interesting conundrum from an operant perspective, because especially in the last couple decades of Skinner's life, so good old Burris, right? In the last couple decades of his life, he particularly focused on talking about reinforcement as a selection mechanism. So this is as a second level of selection. So if we talk about evolution and natural selection, so Skinner also noted he talked about 3 levels of selection, and that second level of selection was happening well, both the second and third level, he talked about happening within the life of the organism, right? So at the ontogenetic or ontogenic level. And that second level was reinforcement. So he talked about reinforcement as a selection mechanism. Now, what's interesting about that is that the conundrum is that reinforcement as a selection mechanism is really more about selecting behavior than it is creating behavior, right? So that's the conundrum. Now, there are important ways that we can talk about creating new behavior. One of those is part of what both of you mentioned, which is eliciting novel behavior. So now we're talking about generating the behavior in a non-operant way. But another important, and this is where I don't want to upset any of my behavior analyst friends by making it sound like I'm saying reinforcement doesn't create new behavior, because an important distinction about this that people like Epstein and Skinner, so Robert Epstein and Skinner themselves did a bunch of studies, part of what they called the Columban experiments. And in that, they looked at things like Kohler's insight. So the concept of insight. And this was, if you think of that traditional early 20th century, Kohler did this work where he set up, gave chimpanzees, might have been bonobos because it's early 20th century, but gave them the ability to reach bananas either through sticks or through boxes, but they had to figure out how to use them, and observed those responses and called that insight. So what Epstein and Skinner did was say, we can explain insight through operant contingencies, and they just trained the separate contingencies, right? So they trained the ability, they trained pigeons with key pecking. So these are pigeons. They trained basically the ability to peck a key with a banana on it for food, and then be able to move boxes, and then showed that putting those two different response classes or those response topographies together would create this new behavior that other people might describe as insight. So that's one way that operant contingencies create new behavior, which is really, really interesting, amazing to see from that perspective.
Totally agree. And I think, I think it's just our language, right? I think in animal training, we just use sort of this, colloquial language as opposed to the precise language of behavior science. And so it gets a little muddied, but I totally agree with you. I love those experiments, and I do have them on one of my podcasts. I think of the one that I did with Erica Feuerbacher, where I link those videos from Epstein's site, so people can see, because as you know, the mirror test one is still really prevalent in the zoological community as evidence of self-awareness, where really all the mirror test shows is how much experience an animal has with a mirror, as opposed to self-awareness. And
I was, so a lot of the what's interesting within animal behavior, and there's similar concepts, and a lot of this I like to talk about because I talk to a lot of different people within academia. I'm one of those weird people that floats around through different communities. And I think behavior analysts had typically had a long history of being a bit isolationist, where some of that was because of Skinner himself very much demanded that people talk a particular way about behavior. Otherwise, and when people would say things, including other ethologists, he would say, well, what you mean is, and he would do this. So there's a long tradition of doing that. I think it serves a certain important purpose, but at times I also think that can isolate the behavior analytic community. In fact, there's even people that will argue that behavior analysis should be isolated from all of the rest of psychology. So there's things like the behaviorology movement. I won't get into that, but nonetheless, theory of mind, which is something that's become prevalent. So what you're talking about with the mirror test, the self-awareness concept, and this is looking for some of these human-like traits in animals at some level. It's theory of mind specifically is talking about awareness at some level, some looking for the consciousness of non-human animals. Typically is what they're interested in. They'll use different words, but I think there's really interesting concepts within that. I used to actually occasionally attend Colin Allen's. So Dr. Colin Allen, who's a philosophy professor at Indiana University, and I would attend his lab meetings, often be the jerk in the room and challenge these concepts that they would say. But nonetheless, I mean, I attended with the interest of talking about some of these concepts because there's really interesting stuff to talk about there. So sometimes that language barrier, I hate for the language barrier between different people with similar interests to be the only thing that's holding up those two communities from talking to each other. I've watched behavior analysts do this with cognitive psychologists, where they refuse because of the way some of this is really important philosophical differences. So I don't want to get away from that. But I'll give you another example that's really interesting because this is really relevant for all of applied animal behavior and animal welfare and what we're talking about here, which are affective states. So this is something affective neuroscience has been interested in. I'm less interested in the PANCSEP kind of stuff, the affective neuroscience aspects. I know very little, but I am interested in what we're talking about in terms of affective states with respect to welfare. So, and I think that's important. All right, so I'm jumping down.
It's relevant because I think one of the things that both Annette and I do as people, and this was one of our talking points, is about the work we do with different communities around the world. I definitely, I cannot use super precise behavior analytic language in the different places that I consult around the world, because then I am not going to be an effective consultant, to be quite honest. There are such language barriers sometimes the words would not even be able to be translated, to be quite honest. Sometimes I'm trying to speak in the language of the people that I'm working with, like especially the work that I've done in Indonesia, which is the subject of the article for the Operance magazine. Working with orangutans in a conservation project in Indonesia. And the people that may be taking care of the animals, they may not even be specialists in animal care. They may have been people that have been hired from the village to take care of the animals. But you know what? They are the people working with the animals, and they are the ones who need to be able to understand what they need to do to influence animal behavior. So I'm not even going to say reinforcement. That isn't even a word that I need to say. I just need to say, you know what we said actually? We said, this is how it was translated: give the animal a prize. That was the language that we said.
Right.
I learned how to say a few words in the language there. So it was sagat bagus, which is very good. Kasih makan, give food. So we really learned how to say things in the most basic language necessary. And so sometimes I think you and I have talked about this, Eddie, and I know Annette and I have, that we don't even talk about positive versus negative reinforcement. It's just give the animal what it wants. And does the animal want distance? We can get technical and say, well, we're removing an aversive stimulus. We don't even need to say that. We can just say, give the animal what it wants. Right now it wants you to go away, and we're going to give it right at this moment when we see this body language. I don't need to get any more technical than that to help this person and this animal. And I think those are really important points when we're trying to be effective communicators with this information. When it really comes down to, we're trying to improve animal welfare, we don't need to, impress everybody with how scientific we can be with our language.
No, these are really important points, and you're hitting on our second talking point, but we're really embedded into the third talking point more so here. which is talking about consulting. I also did want to say, I know, and I typed this into chat as well. We have a bunch of questions in chat that I want to come back around to as well. There's some interesting stuff, but also I thought, Annette, were you going to say something about that added on to what Barbara was just saying about consulting and language, all of?
No, I totally agree with her, because the science may be far away from the trainers on the ground, but they can still be very good trainers because they have, you know, a good sense of animal behavior and body language and so on. So yeah, absolutely, I agree with Barbara. It's yeah.
Yeah, I think something that's been, I will say, you know, one of the funny things about science and scientists in general, um, even applied scientists at some level, is sometimes they're not, they become very, the blinders come on and they become very particular about talking about only certain things in only certain ways. So this is by no means that I want to limit this to this is what happens within the behavior analytic community, because I should also note that especially over the past couple decades within applied behavior analysis, applied behavior analysts have gotten very good at talking to many different groups of people, parents, teachers, etc. Much better, I think. They were always, there were some applied behavior analysts from the early days, even, like if you got to spend any time around people like Don Bear, he was an incredible speaker and really wonderful human being. I mean, you just enjoyed being around him because of how nice he was. So he did a wonderful job of talking to people that weren't just academicians. So there's a long history of this, but I really think over the past couple of decades, applied behavior analysts have gotten particularly good at translating some of their knowledge to people outside of their usual circle. So nonetheless, I think this is all, and I think feeding into this third talking point, this is one of the most important parts, I think, of all of this, of being able to effectively consult, especially when it's way outside of your bubble. And there's a lot of stuff way outside of my bubble. Sometimes I'm surprised what people let me talk about because I feel like I have a very narrow set of skills, and people will say, "Hey, can you come talk to us about dogs in shelters?" And I go, I can talk about what I'm willing to talk about with that, what I know, but there's a lot that I don't know. But nonetheless, this is a really important part of effectively consulting and setting up programs. And then I want to shut up and let you all talk about this. That this is a really important part of that is talking to these, going outside of your bubble, talking to circles that are outside and effectively communicating. So that means not just talking to, but listening to people that are outside of your normal circle, having language that is not a hurdle for that. So like what you mentioned, Barbara, about using the term prize, is really, that's great. That's important. I often talk about rewards for a couple important reasons. I use the word reward far more than I ever use reinforcer. So nonetheless, I'm going to shut up and let you all mention more things about consulting and whatnot.
Well, I don't know. And then one of the things we were talking about, with IAZA, the Animal Training Working Group, the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums is very different from AZA in that, Europe is so many different languages. And, as Annette was saying, you can just go a short distance and you're in another country that's speaking a different language. And so that, Animal Training Working Group has to be able to serve a really diverse community. Maybe you have more to add on that, Annette.
Yeah. I don't know. You think about that we do courses and you know, try to work with these people, and we have in a training group, we have of course very different languages, so we can kind of serve most of the different countries in Europe. But yeah, it's a big issue or a big challenge to work with so many different languages. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't
So
know if there was any specific thing you were talking about.
Well, and you've taught the workshops. You've taught the workshop in how many different countries, like Estonia and Greece and where else?
Yeah, that's true, but always in English, and that actually that is an issue because there's a lot of countries, especially when you go to the Southern Europe, that only speak like Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, or you get in the middle section where they only speak like German. So, you know, I don't speak anything else than English besides Danish, of course. I don't get far with that. So that's a challenge in many countries that, yeah, even though we do workshops in English, that's a challenge in a lot of German speaking countries like Switzerland, Austria, German, of course. So yeah, that's yeah.
So let me ask this, because I think this is important, and there's some questions that people are asking in the chat too, and we'll come around to these here in a second, but some of these are related because I think this is important too. But if you show up to a new facility, a new country in some cases, because this is stuff like what Barbara talks about in her Operance magazine article, and what you've talked about a little bit here too, where you're working with people that know nothing in many cases about either training or behavior management, behavior other than what they've, nothing traditionally learned, right? So they know nothing about operant conditioning. They just know some of what they've experienced anecdotally. Where do you start? Where do you start at that point?
I would say yeah, Barbara, you have a lot of experience in that.
I mean, I have a process that I do as a consultant, but but usually, there's a combination of lecture and hands-on things that we do. The lecture, I don't overwhelm, just like you would train, a behavior to an animal. We do the same process with humans. We don't try to do everything at once. We start with some small stuff in terms of the instructional part. One of the nice things about my material is, those of you that already learned from me, is I use a lot of video, and that really helps with the language barriers. People can relate to watching videos, and I keep those videos short. There's not a lot of words in them, and so they watch and they see. And if I've already got some information about what kind of challenges the facility has, or what kind of goals they have, I can make sure that material is included. And then usually as we go through different days and we've gone out and we've worked with different animals, I see what some of the things are that they're trying to work on. I can pull, I have, you guys know, I have, there we go. We just look at all my drives. I've got tons of videos from my work, and so I just pull from my collection of what I've done over the years and say, I've got a video we're going to watch. Here's what we're going to do. And so the next time we go out and have a session with that animal or those animals, we're going to try to apply this. And so people have an image in their head of what we're going to do. And so again, it helps with the language barriers. And I can show people a little bit, or I can, kind of put my hands on their hands and kind of manipulate their hands a little bit if again, we're having language barrier issues. So it's a very, applied type of thing. It's not so reliant on talking and communications sometimes, verbal communication in those situations. So yeah, so there's a lot of visual stuff to it all that helps people make progress. And I think one of the things in my world, as Annette knows, is that I'm very much about making progress. So my visits aren't, I'm not there for a month. I'm usually there anywhere from 3 to 5 days at a time, and we make progress. We get behavior, and again, it's a, a non-coercive approach. I'm very much about, trying to use methods that are all about, good animal welfare. And so we get behavior, and that's part of it too. I want my human learner, to also feel good about what's happened here, like they're able to accomplish things and have animals do behavior based on what they're doing. And so it's and we have fun. I want people to have fun doing it too. So that's a big part of it as well. And I'm usually videotaping everything. So at the end, usually by the last day, we have a collection of their before and after, what the animal was doing before and our result now. And we get to look at all those videos at the end, and everybody's like, whoa, look what we did. So that's usually the process.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Barbara, and you just said about the videos, because I think videos are an invariable work. I mean, we use videos a lot, because even though we do a session and everything is kind of, discussed and the trainer knows exactly what they're doing, we still videotape it, because afterwards, when you go over the training session and you say, oh, if you just put this a little bit to the right, and you would be able to see that the animal would respond much more in your favor. It's hard to explain afterwards, but when you go over a video, and also people are very often not aware of everything they do. So we can stand in the back and watch these people. We can just relax and just focus on the trainer and the animal. But the trainers actually doing the job has to be very focused on the animal, and are not often so focused on themselves. So when you kind of say, oh, I think you should move your foot a bit when you ask for that thing over here. And they say, oh, did I have my foot there? I didn't notice. And when they see it on video afterwards, it makes much more sense. So it's a great tool. We use it a lot.
Yeah, and I think an important part that both of you are bringing up here too is using some of the when it comes to consulting and getting other people to train animals, you're using a lot of the same principles, the same behavioral principles for the training of animals as you are to train people to train animals, of course, which is really relevant, right? So you're using approximations, you're trying to use rewards for those approximations that you're shaping to some target behavior. So here again, you're generating new behavior, the ability to train an animal by combining some simple steps that might already exist in their repertoire.
And I want to add to that, Eddie, because sometimes people like, if they watch one of those videos that, of maybe one of the people that I've worked with learning something, I'll find that other people get really critical of the person doing the training, and they start looking for like, oh, the timing of the bridge, or he's bridging too much, or he's this or that. And I try to remind people, don't do that. This person is learning, and I wasn't worried about that because that wasn't important right now. The one thing that we're focusing on is this part, and if I overwhelm that person with, and we need to fix this and that and that and then I'm going to lose my learner. As a consultant, part of my job, just like we always talk about, like, oh, I want to build trust with the animal, whatever that construct is. But if I'm trying to build a relationship with this person and I'm bombarding them with everything I think they're doing wrong, I will lose everything with that person. And they're going to think I'm a horrible teacher who's no fun, and all I do is look for everything that they're doing wrong. So just like with an animal, what I'm focusing on when I'm teaching somebody new, that I'm beginning to work with, I'm just working on one aspect of what they're trying to learn. And if I may not even care about whatever their sound is they're using as a bridge, because the animal's probably not even paying attention to it. So it's irrelevant, so I don't care if they're saying good or they're saying, oh, you're so cute, and because the animal doesn't care. And so, if we want to take that out later, we will, but it's probably completely irrelevant to the training. But I've got all these nitpicky trainers who are watching the video going, oh my gosh, I can't believe the person's saying all that. And I'm going, I don't even care about that. So don't worry about it.
Yeah,
No,
yeah,
I-
get the approximations,
Mhm.
and you focus on one thing at a time and start moving in that direction. And all of that is particularly relevant. I mean, sometimes I like to summarize a lot of my general ethical philosophy when it comes to behavioral management as don't be a jerk. So that's a lot. That's a lot of my general ethical philosophy. You know what?
Mm.
As I've jokingly said, here you have two options. One is being more of a jerk, and the other one's being less of a jerk. Pick less of a jerk. So now, what that means is a different thing, and we can that gets into some of our second talking point. But before we go there, I did want to come back around because there are some questions that people are asking. And one of the first questions, I think it was Sarah asked this, and I know almost nothing. I have almost no experience with eclectus. So, but they were asking a question. I don't know if, to me, it sounds like stuff that is, well, I'll state specifically. So, was asking about a female eclectus, ways to make a female eclectus not hormonal and stop them from laying eggs. So then that's the part of, I was going to say we need to operationally define what being hormonal is, but there's already part of that specific observable response defined there, which is the laying eggs part. So, and to me, that I don't know. I have absolutely no idea I don't know what experience both of you have with.
Well, this is sort of an off the cuff answer. So generally when we talk about hormonal, they're talking about reproductive hormones are amplified.
Yeah.
And female eclectus parrots are sort of notoriously known for being more inclined to be triggered into a reproductive state more easily than other parrots because they do reproduce year round. The typical things for parrots that are likely to trigger reproductive hormone amplification are access to a nest site. So these guys are big time cavity seekers. So if you have anything that that they can turn into a cavity, that's a trigger. Because they're reproductive year round, changing light cycles isn't going to help you. The diet can be a huge contributor. So if they have a diet that's rich in carbohydrates, rich in fats, overabundant, because when you think about it, an animal that's more likely to reproduce is one that has all the good things available to it, so that it's like, this is a great time to make babies. I've got all the food and things available. I can feed a family. So those are things that contribute to that. Just again, you go back to what are all the conditions that make it perfect for raising a family. And if all those conditions are there, that makes it more likely that an animal is going to go into a reproductive state, which makes it more likely to produce eggs. One thing you do want to keep in mind about parrots is that cranking out the eggs is taxing on the body. They pull calcium from the bones, which can cause them to go calcium deficient, which can be a life-threatening condition. So one of the things you want to do is probably have a visit with your veterinarian who specializes in birds. They're going to give you more advice on this. They may suggest Lupron, which is a hormone which will suppress those hormones, but it's only temporary. It's not a long-term solution. You still have to manage the environment so that the bird is less likely to go into a reproductive state. There's lots more information about this out there on the internet, but again, a lot of it is about managing the environment, managing the diet so that they're less likely. And also having a pair-like bond with another bird or human. So reinforcing those pair-like relationships also contributes to that. So reinforcing those behaviors such as, regurgitating, because they do, feed each other, that sort of regurgitating stuff, all those things can contribute to that. So that's the short answer.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, because that's the kind of stuff that I was looking that I was hoping you would be able to provide, is some specific environmental management techniques. I mean, me not knowing anything about eclectus, I was just going to say something like, I don't know, don't let them visit eclectus OnlyFans pages. But that's
It's
probably
similar thing.
right. That's a stop. Don't let your, here, I'll date myself here a little bit. Don't let your eclectus watch late night Cinemax.
Also, again.
Stop letting them visit all the sexy internet pages. But that's right. So we're talking about environmental management at some level.
Yeah.
And that's interesting to see how that can affect. And you mentioned also some of the potential relevant aspects about managing hormones medically through veterinary procedures as well. But a lot of this sounds like it's relevant in terms of environmental management. So that's cool. And we don't have to talk about Eclectus OnlyFans pages anymore. So
She's already on it.
please don't Google that at all. I don't know. Let's see what other questions we had. How to train more calm behaviors in more active species like Cotties, Guadamundis. So Cotties, which are carnivora, they're in the raccoon family, very closely related to raccoons. Cotties, very adorable. They look like stretched South American raccoons. So anybody who's not familiar with that can look that up. I've never actually worked with Cotties. So I mean, I can talk about training calm behaviors in carnivore, but I think this is, we have two experts here. Let me default. I'm gonna shift there. So
Well, even as a behavior analyst, we there's certain questions we would want to ask first anyway, right?
Right. Yeah. So well, we can talk about first off, what are we looking for? What's the context? What are we operationally defining as calm in this case? And what are the conditions under which we want that to occur? Usually I tend to focus on things that I want to increase. So I think that's very common for people to say things like, I need to get rid of this behavior. I want to get rid of these things. That's why we often focus on things like calm, or I want my dog to not bark. Right? Okay, well, what do you want to see the dog doing? So in this case, I would want to know, what are we looking for the Quaddy to do? Especially as an animal welfare scientist, I'm often thinking about what are the things, so what specifically is problematic? What can we look at observably that's problematic? And then are there things that we can increase that produce a decrease in that behavior? That said, I know almost nothing about Quaddies. So I don't know what other than the little information I gave.
Go ahead, Annette. You sounded like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, but it's not so interesting. I would just say that I have absolutely no experience with Cotties. Yeah, I've never worked with them.
Yeah, I've worked with them. But and they can be super active animals. I mean, they're like, if you're in South America or Mexico, they're running around, digging through the garbage and all that kind of stuff. And but the main thing that I would be asking about is, I guess my head goes to, like you're saying, like why and under what circumstances, why, what is the animal, what is this condition in which the animal is being super active that you need it to be calm? You know what I mean? Like sometimes people use Quaddies in educational programming, and is it the situation where you're trying to have this animal out as an animal ambassador and it's just all over the place, and so you're uncomfortable with that? I feel like I want more information to understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish here, if that makes sense. Yeah. Okay. So calm-like station and cooperative care. They're like raccoons, but more energetic and diurnal. Yeah. So, and then, like I said, in the garbage cans.
Yeah.
We call them trash pandas here in the United States, is what we call raccoons. So, so you can kind of get the calm-like station and cooperative care. So maybe working towards maybe for medical behaviors, so like sit on a station, hold still for medical behavior. So, one of the things that, one Quaddy that I worked with, we basically trained it to sit still on a stump for scratching, to be quite honest. This particular individual really responded well to one of those back scratchers. And so we use that as the reinforcer for sitting calmly. And sometimes tactile can be a really great reinforcer for those kind of behaviors where you need a calm response. And sometimes using food as a reinforcer for those kinds of behaviors is a less preferred type of reinforcer, just because you might get a different kind of, topography of behavior. And so we did use scratching for a coati for a stationing behavior. And in fact, the animal would just get so like, oh, and then if you paused for scratching for a minute, it was kind of like, what? And then if you start scratching again, he's like, oh, even more of a calm, relaxed thing. So, sometimes reinforcer, what you select as a reinforcer can make a difference in how that behavior is going to look. And that's just an easy way to get a calm, relaxed response. Certainly you can use food. These guys respond really well to grapes and mealworms. It might take you a lot more work in terms of reinforcing that calm response. But it can be done. One of the things I find with animals that I'm trying to build duration for a calm, for anything, if it's just like holding position or whatever, sometimes when I have to deliver individual pieces of things or food items, you have to deliver it so rapid fire, it's really challenging. So anytime I can deliver a fluid, and then I can, so like I'm depressing a plunger or I'm using like a juice bottle, so I'm getting that continual stream, and then all I have to do is put a little pause in that stream, and then I'm going to make that pause longer and longer and longer. I find that works a lot better for me in having that really precise timing when I'm working towards trying to get that perfect, hold this position and just keep that position, because I can really like turn on and off that stream of that reinforcer coming. And so I get that perfect position, and it's like, it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off, and then it's off for a little bit longer, and then a little bit longer, and a little bit longer. And I really get that nice, perfect position held. And because when you're delivering food, things get a little messier, right? They don't go to the perfect spot, or, you have to move your hand back and forth as opposed to your hand being right there and just squeezing the bottle, not squeezing the bottle, squeezing the bottle, not squeezing the bottle. And so you start getting, a messier position. So if you're really looking for like perfect position, finding ways to deliver liquid reinforcers where you don't have to move around a lot is a nice way to get that perfect position. And so I haven't tried that with a coati, but you could do that potentially. You could try it. There's some things, you could try grape juice or something like that, or I don't know. I haven't tried it. Like I said, it works great with a lot of different primates. But that might be something to consider. You might start with protected contact at first so that you don't get grabbiness or anything like that. But that might be another way. But again, scratches might work even better. But this is the kind of stuff that I love experimenting with and trying out. And, when we were talking about selecting, I'm going to use selecting as my word, selecting the response that you want. This is the kind of stuff that I really get off on as an animal trainer, because this is the kind of stuff that you have to figure out through all these years of experience with different species, and the mechanics of how you deliver stuff, and trying out all these weird different little, I don't know, things that you find at the hardware store or whatever. These are the weird things that Annette and I do. And, we can call each other up and go, look at this cool bucket I found at IKEA. It's so much better than what I was using that I bought on, some animal training site.
It's such an important part too. I mean, it's what happens with so much research as well. Since I'm on the research end of this, and I'm often looking for the apparatuses that I'm using to enable these things to occur. And because I've done a lot of training research as well, I'm combining those two skills. I was going to mention about the bottle and using fluid rewards. There's a few awesome things about that too, and a lot of people have used that for various husbandry training procedures with ursids and cats, and I'll talk briefly about some of the there's some stuff there too with domestic cats, it's really relevant as well. But for one of the nice things about using some type of fluid reward, and by the way, this is all going to lead into, Gabe brought up a point about reinforcement selection, and that will help lead into our second point as well.
Oh,
When food,
Eddie, can I add something to Barbara?
yeah, please do.
Sorry.
Please. Interrupting me is a good thing, by the way. So please, I want to tell you that it's
It was
important,
just,
because otherwise I just, I go on a ramble. So it's good to, yes, but please.
that's perfectly okay. It's just before you swap to another topic.
Yeah.
It was just that when Barbara talked about the scratching and how, feeding can change the topography of the animal behavior in an unwanted way, I thought about tapirs. Tapirs are typically getting very eager when there's food around and totally relaxed when there's no food and when they're scratching. So we would always use scratching with the tapirs, because otherwise we would not have any idea what all the teeth are, because they will go like grab for food. And we would get exactly the opposite of what we wanted. But what I also see sometimes when people use not fluid, but some kind of food reinforcer, is that if you say that work on calm behavior, work on just duration for the animal to sit still and just look at you, or just not running around. What I often see is that this mistake is made, that they feed and then they wait for the animal to be calm, and while they're waiting, the animal starts to build up more and more frustration, and then they can't reinforce, and they get into some, like we did with the panda. So what I've seen often helps is like Barbara said, like just fire feed, and you can see how the whole body starts to go, whew, because at this point, if this is the first behavior you teach an animal, just to stay calm, look at me, have focus and concentrate, and they have no idea what they're supposed to do. So they try everything. They try to grab you, and they try to grab the bars, and they try to hop up and down and do a lot of things to get what you want. But if you teach them, you'll get it. You just sit there, you just get it. And you can see the body language just go, and you can start adding, the small pauses in between, but you can't do it in the beginning. And this is the most typical mistakes I see, that people start working on duration from the first reinforcer they give. You understand what I mean?
Right. That's
careful.
Yeah. Reinforcement rate is a really important component, because of how easy it is to produce ratio strain, which then starts producing these mini extinction bursts. I mean, that's in essence what you're doing, is running these successive schedules of reinforcement extinction, right? And that's what that's part of why that rate of reinforcement is so important. I didn't want to go too much else about the fluid, going back to the reinforcement. I did want to come back to Gabe's point here, which is really important, about talking about even non-food rewards. But the nice thing about using sprays or some type of fluid reinforcer, like what Barbara was mentioning, especially with earthids, with cats, with many of the animals you see in zoos and aquaria, is that you have to be really cautious about feeding too much, right? So I published a paper last year with an African crested porcupine that Nicole Dory and I actually did a shaping project with almost a couple decades ago. So it was a long time coming for that paper to be published. But that porcupine, I think, would have actually, I didn't know that it knew that satiation even existed, right? So I think the porcupine would have literally exploded from eating too many apple slices if we didn't have cutoff limits. And that becomes a problem for all. We have to be, at some point, I think this is something that's going to be talked about a lot more, even within the dog training, the clicker training community, is, hey, how do we be better about managing the amount of food that we're using? So that's all I was going to say about the spray. Is that's one thing that's nice, is you can dilute the potential rewards as well. You can really use, so you can take something like a grape juice and make it very small parts mixed with water and still have effective rewards. And you can test all those things too with things like preference assessments, which is part of getting at what Gabe was talking about here, because he was asking to expand upon reinforcement selection for new behavior, where typical food reinforcement methods might be frightening. So talking about, in this case, I'm guessing, Gabe, you're talking about animals that you might not be able to effectively use food rewards with, and that you're trying to produce some new behavior, which this gets at the second talking point that Barbara, Annette, and I were going to talk about. And I'll just allude to that briefly by saying I have a paper that I published last year and talking about exactly this, training quote unquote fearful sheep. So these were sheep that would not allow you to get anywhere near them, let alone pet them, and they were petting zoo sheep. So the title of our paper was actually Training Petting Zoo Sheep to Act Like Petting Zoo Sheep. That was part of the title, right? Because not a great petting zoo if the sheep can't be pet, right? Kind of defeats the purpose of a petting zoo. And that was our big problem, was the sheep. You couldn't use food as a potential reward for the sheep. They wouldn't let you get anywhere near it. Now, at that time, when we did this study a couple decades ago, Alexandra Kurland had talked a little bit about working with a llama, that she would click and then walk away. So we're talking about using the ability to of moving away, of removing herself as the aversive, as a negative reinforcer for the behavior of approaching and looking at her. And that's what we ended up doing. I'll post a link, all of that, to this article. That's what we did with the sheep, was we started using our removal, so our presence as a negative reinforcer, the removal of us, to reward the sheep approaching us. So and once we got that behavior, they started approaching us pretty quickly and very effectively. It was a great method. Once we got that to where they were coming near us, they started eating in our presence, and we were able to switch to food rewards. So Barbara's very familiar with. She's talked a bit about this procedure. This is stuff that Kelly Snyder then later, so this was one of the first programs back in the I think it was maybe a year or two after I had started the Organization for Reinforcement Contingencies with Animals, or ORCA, down at North Texas. This was one of our earliest zoo projects. And a few years later, Kelly Snyder started developing a similar procedure, what's called constructional aggression treatment. Did I say that correct? I sometimes mess up these, because there's a similar procedure, behavioral adjustment training, although I'm not sure what that's called now either. But nonetheless, there are different procedures that are about using as your reward the removal of the fearful stimulus. So we're talking about negative reinforcement as a contingency, but in a non-coercive way. That's the important part here. And that's really relevant. And that's now we're talking about using things just like what Barbara and Annette talked about here, with using tactile rewards, so non-food rewards. This is another tool in the belt for using something. Now, in this case, potentially not only not a food reward, but also for an animal that might be fearful or even aggressive towards you. So that's an important part. So I hope that got at some of, and I'll post links to this as well, that sheet paper. I just, again, I keep throwing out a lot of words in a long stream there. So I want, please add to that, Barbara, Annette, and I'll keep.
I just think it's, I've talked about it a lot this last couple of years because it's something I think relatively new in my repertoire and maybe for others as well. Just because people are sensitive to the word negative reinforcement. And you and I have talked about it, Eddie, as well, that, we definitely want people to understand it's a particular application of the procedure because we certainly want people to be sensitive to the fact that we're not advocates of coercive applications of negative reinforcement. We're still really being specific about a very specific application, a very specific procedure that's quite non-coercive. But I really have been sensitive now to whenever I see an animal showing that body language, that there's an aversive stimulus in the environment, that's already existing in the environment, or that maybe we have introduced, but we didn't expect it to be aversive, but oh my gosh, the animal has given us the body language that, whoa, that's aversive. To me, that's a red flag, and it immediately is sending off all sorts of whistles and bells in my head that I need to think about what procedure should I be using here. And I think in the past, we traditionally have thought, well, I just need to pair food with this, and I just need to bring this scary thing closer. But when you think about what you're asking the animal to do there, when you do that, is you're really telling that animal, and now in my head, the way I think about that is I think, wow, when I do that, I'm really being coercive. I'm saying, you know what, you got to fight all the fear in your body and tolerate this scary thing coming towards you and take my food item. And when I think of that stimulus picture in my head, I think, man, that's really coercive. And now when I think about what I'm doing using what we've called so many different things, but is essentially I think maybe just a non-coercive application of negative reinforcement. Right. I think what I'm doing instead is far kinder when I'm saying, you know what, you're way far away. Here's that thing that I already have observed you don't want to deal with. And that's so far away that you barely notice it, and you've acknowledged it, or maybe it's so far away that you don't even hardly care it's there. And you're giving me relaxed body language. And you know what? That's fabulous. I love that relaxed body language. Guess what? That scary thing is gone. It's out of here. And I'm going to reinforce that calm body language that you gave me. I think that stimulus picture is a lot kinder than the other one of saying, here, take this food in the presence of this scary thing. And the animal's going, no, 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 no.
Yeah. And this is something, Barbara, we've spent a lot of time talking about this because one of the really important points here, and something that people have spent, so if we put all our emphasis on just trying to superimpose positive reinforcement on top of any and every situation. By the way, there's a long history within behavior analysis of doing just that. It's part of what was called behavior modification, so BMOD, within behavior analysis in the 80s. And what you saw were behavior analysts that often with very little to no training and research, that they were just trained in behavioral principles, and they would show up to school settings. They would show up to prisons. These are some of the places where you saw a lot of BMOD take place. They'd show up working in institutions with developmentally disabled adults, and they would just say, oh, well, let's, regardless of the function of behavior, let's just impose some type of positive reinforcement condition, because it's all about positive reinforcement. That's all we need to focus on. By the way, similar and what I've been incredibly critical of, as many behavior analysts, including many applied behavior analysts have been, the early days of much of autism therapy relied heavily on this superimposing of reinforcement contingencies, to the extent to where they restricted the behavior of the subjects they were working with. But they could say, but I'm using positive reinforcement, and it's positive reinforcement in the most coercive way. A similar thing has happened within the animal training community, where people are in many cases actively advocating for things like food deprivation, or using food deprivation, and they can say, but I'm using positive reinforcement. So I think that that's difficult. So what's important here is this focusing on the function of the behavior. And so the simple example I use, and this is what much of applied behavior analysis has done, is you try to understand and address the function of the behavior. And if the behavior is to escape some type of condition. So I'll give you this example. Here's the simplest example I can give you all. So let's say you have a child that needs to go to the bathroom. So what do you want them to do? You want them to ask, can I use the bathroom, right? So if this is a school setting or something like that, they ask for permission. Can I use the bathroom? Are you going to reward that appropriate asking by saying, that was great asking, and just start giving them candy, right? Just start giving them treats, right? No, because what's maintaining that request is the desire to use the bathroom. They have to relieve themselves. And so you are using, under that condition, a negative reinforcer. You're using a negative reinforcement contingency by permitting them to use the bathroom. That's not coercive negative reinforcement. And that is an important, and this is applied behavior analysis does this all the time when dealing with escape maintained behavior. Sometimes this is really important. If the animal is trying to get away from a trainer, the focus at that point should not be food. So we need to be clear. Yeah, we need to be clear about, let's remove the aversive contingencies here. I mean, we can just arrange the environment so that let's just make them more hungry, or let's just restrict more of the environment. And then I was able to use positive reinforcement. But that's incredibly coercive positive reinforcement at that point. So this is where these important steps come in, with understanding, being sensitive to what is, or again, falling down to my simplicity of saying, hey, maybe be less of a jerk. If your option is more of a jerk or less of a jerk, I know we do have conditions where relying exclusively on positive reinforcement is actually being more of a jerk. So maybe don't start trying to make the animal more hungry so it's willing to work, it's willing to deal with what it already finds aversive with the experience of the trainer, because it's just too hungry at that point and wants the food. That's not a good condition.
People have to let go of some sort of, religion when it comes to animal training, and understand the principles, understand the science.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I want to add what me and Jim actually talked about a while ago. Jim Mackey from London Zoo, we talk a lot too. And I think that there's also, which is quite unfortunate, a problem with the terms themselves, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. So the words are already loaded before you actually start knowing about what they are. It sounds better. I mean, so I think that's one of the mistakes Skinner made. Oh, not one, but I don't know if he made any more. I think it's a shame that these words are attached to these procedures, because they're already emotionally loaded before you actually know what it is.
Yeah, I think so. This is what there's some interesting points here too along those lines. By the way, I did want to mention and give a shout out to Jim Mackey, because he's another contributor for the special issue talking about primate training with the London Zoological Society. He does amazing work out there in the UK with training primates. So he'll be involved in that. And also Lauren Novak wrote an article about some of the ills of the quadrants, or the over-reliance on the use of the quadrants, that will show up. So both Jim Mackey and Lauren, this is relevant, what she wrote for Operance Magazine, that special issue. So what I will say is, I at least have a little bit of a disagreement at some level with part of that, Annette, in saying that I don't know that the problem is the use of the term positive and negative reinforcement, but so Jack Michael in 1975 wrote an article about we don't need to make a distinction, essentially. Now he was using a pretty clear cases. And by the way, Eileen Anderson has a wonderful blog about interpreting Jack Michael's 75 article. But the idea was Jack Michael was talking about some of the problems with putting the or even making a distinction between positive and negative reinforcement. Michael was making an argument that we should just be talking about reinforcement at that level, increasing behavior. This is something that Barron and Galizio in 2005 then echoed this same sentiment. So they said, similar to what you're saying, Annette, I tend to side more with Murray Sidman on this issue than necessarily either Michael or Barron and Galizio. I think there are, so this is where I was saying I have some disagreement. I think there are important distinctions between positive, negative reinforcement. I think the bigger problem has been how we've framed what that means. And here's why this is relevant. So I will say, when I hear people describe, so the issue is not so much with the term negative reinforcement, it's what people have used to describe their procedure as being only negative reinforcement, or this is what it is, right? So the argument shouldn't be against negative reinforcement or against even aversives in general. What I have said is the argument is against the type, so the type, intensity, and frequency of the aversives used. And that's where this important of coercion plays an important part. But so this is the point I was just going to make about this in terms of inappropriate descriptions that are attributed to negative reinforcement. When I see somebody who uses a choke collar, a pinch collar, a shock collar, and they say, I'm just using negative reinforcement. And the irony is here that it's both people within the force-free community and the traditional or balanced training community that describe those tools as negative reinforcement tools. I say that is incredibly disingenuous, because those tools rely primarily on positive punishment. They punish everything that they possibly can, and then they select one or two things that they negatively reinforce by the removal of all those aversives, the choking, the pinching, the shocking. And more importantly, it's not because what the argument would be, but I'm not shocking, I'm not choking, I'm not pinching that much, but the threat of the choke, of the pinch, of the shock is there through the conditioned aversive stimuli that you have paired with that. So it is all those aversives that are present, and then only a couple behaviors result in the termination of those aversives. We should not be calling that. So that's where the problem is. We should not be calling that negative reinforcement. That is a high frequency contrived use of aversive stimulation for the purpose of punishing a lot of behavior and negatively reinforcing one or two responses. That I will always argue is problematic. I am 100% against the use of choke, shock, pinch collars. Absolutely. Not because they are using negative reinforcement, but because of what they do. So anyway, got on my soapbox.
No, Debbie Downer, man. Now the conversation. Yeah.
Sorry, had to get on my soapbox for a second there. Let's focus on the happy. But sorry, Annette, I think you had something you wanted to add to that. So again, me and my skills occasionally.
And I totally agree. I mean, I think it has just a bad name, it has bad reputation, but I think that just, before you even know anything about quadrants and science, and the first thing you hear is something is negative and something is positive. I mean, you're already set then, so when you hear positive reinforcement, oh, that must be the good one. And when you hear negative reinforcement, you go, that doesn't sound so good. That's something negative. And people, you just, throw the words around. So I totally agree with you, and Barbara knows that because we talk a lot about cat. And I was worried about it in the beginning because I was worried that it may, you know, if you were not totally very good at looking at body language, and you were really good at picking up, you know, fear response, and you could actually end up flooding the animal. But the more I've heard from Barbara, and actually I've tried it myself using the cat, I was surprised that how fast it worked, and there's so many good things to say about it, because I know it's maybe a label, and because I don't know all the scientific words and terms, but I think it's a more honest way to train, actually. If you have an animal that's fearful, like Barbara described before, and you want to superimpose that fear by showing food, it's actually not an honest way to play the game. So right. I think, and that actually, I realized that it was like a light bulb, you know, when I heard the podcast with Joe Lang, because he explained it so well, that he did with Barbara last summer, because I was home on follow, so I could listen to a great podcast, and I heard the whole 6 hours with you and Joe too, and I'm totally in the cat thing. I think it's and which is based on negative reinforcement, I should say. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an important tool. And that's what is absolutely relevant here. And it's something that this was written into the basic concepts from 1968 from Beowulf and Risley, going back to the start, the very first article in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis talks about the 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis, and the functionality, along with technology and all the other dimensions. So being relevant, being functional, and those applied components are absolutely integral. So knowing that so if all we're doing is attempting to superimpose positive reinforcement at that level, that's problematic. We have to be sensitive to what is happening for the organism, and all of applied behavior analysis. I mean, this has been for 3+ decades. This has been a big part of applied behavior analysis, is how do we properly assess the function so that we directly address the function of the behavior. And that's something, and the, you know, short answer is we need data to do that at some level. So this is an argument I've made just a few times for the applied animal community, the applied animal behavior community, the animal training community, is we need to figure out ways to use more data. But the similar argument that I've said is when our treatments are functional, when they are relevant to the function of the behavior, we don't have to worry about where it fits within the quadrants, quote unquote, the quadrants. We don't have to worry. This is what is most applicable. If you have an animal that the behavior that you are trying to intervene on is escape maintained, we need to find a proper contingency, like what I did with the sheep, what Alexandra Kurland talked about doing with the llama, what Kelly has talked about doing with cat, what Joe Lang has talked about with Gold Diamond's constructional approach in general. This is all relevant to addressing the how that behavior functions and adjusting that contingency.
Yeah, and you know, and I get the, you know, again, especially being in school now, the, you know, the drilling for data all the time. But, you know, I will say, we as animal trainers and me as a consultant, what we are doing constantly is evaluating the if-then contingency. If I do this, this happens. If the animal does this, this happens. I mean, that is what I'm constantly doing as an animal training consultant when people are asking me to solve their behavior problems. If the animal does this, this happens. And so, you know, I'm thinking about, like Annette, you know, was telling me how she applied negative reinforcement for a parrot that was afraid of a perch. And, you know, I mean, and it really, you know, that's what we're doing. We're constantly scanning the environment going, well, what happens if you bring up the perch? The parrot does what? He backs away, you know, so, you know, we're constantly doing this all the time, whether we're sitting there taking data or not. But this is what, you know, in terms of like writing down a number, you know, how many times did he do this every time you brought up a perch? But this is how we are making these decisions as animal trainers. We're saying, if I do this, body language I see is escape and avoidance. So that's where we're making our decision that, oh, you know what, this is probably maintained by negative reinforcement. The decision I'm going to make now is to use a negative reinforcement type procedure to address this. It's happening all the time. So I don't know. I mean, I guess what I'm asking trainers to start doing is, instead of just buying into the dogma, I have to train everything with positive reinforcement, start, you know, using what you're already doing. And instead of just saying, oh, I got to train with positive reinforcement, evaluate those if-then contingencies that you are observing constantly. You know, if the animal freaks out, I open the door. Well, what did you just do there? You taught the animal, if he freaks out, I'll open the door for you. You know, so you are increasing that behavior by opening the door. If you want to break it down and identify what, you know, what contingency that is, great, but you better start thinking about the next time you open that door, what behavior do you want that animal to do? So maybe you're not going to wait till the animal's all amped up before you open the door. You're going to wait till he's relaxed, and then you're going to open the door. So you start increasing that behavior instead of amping up. But this is what we are doing as animal trainers all the time. We're looking for those if-then contingencies. So just start thinking about them in a little bit more precise way in terms of what you're reinforcing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wanted to address, because we have an interesting question that came about the LRS, and
I saw that. I'm supposed to say, oh God, we need another hour.
I'll come back to that here in a second, but I did want to say the two things that I would add to this is that the two core components, I mean, the two things that separate the application of behavioral principles. So not, because behavior analysis is defined by data. That is almost every behavior analyst is defining behavior analysis through data. That is how behavior analysis is defined. So one of my prime directives, one of my main goals has been to try to find ways to incorporate data, get people using more data that they can with their behavior management tools. Because otherwise we're going to fall victim to the same kind of ills that happened with the BMOD movement, the behavior modification movement in the 80s, which was suddenly you had all these people, I don't want to call them behavior analysts, they were behavior modifiers, that were showing up to these various settings and saying, all you have to do is set up this token economy with the kids, you know, here's a board, here's gold stars, just reward the things you want to see. And they were doing these just superimposing reinforcement. They were using these token economies in prison settings and school settings, all various different places, without understanding the function of the response, and it created a lot of problems. And there, when you look at some of the most voracious arguments, some of the a sad time for radical behaviorism was some of that period in the 80s, where there were so many people saying, and this is why it's bad, because they were taking bad applications, which were applications of behavioral principles in the absence of identifying function. So applied behavior analysis has agreed with this point for decades, multiple decades. They have been saying, we need to understand the function to address the behavior. And they have specific ways they've said we can address the function, which is through what functional behavior assessments, right? So this is how we are addressing the function. And an absolute requirement for any functional behavior assessment is data. In the least, that means indirect assessment through some type of formal questionnaire, something. So I won't go into too much detail there, but the emphasis is typically on functional analysis at some level. identify function, to try to. So the animal training community, the applied animal behavior community, as a whole, we need to get better at trying to incorporate data in some way. And that's part of what I've tried to work on, because these are approximations. I'm trying to live by these same principles, right? So I can, if I'm saying this and it's not happening, that's not the fault of the trainer. That's the fault of the environment. We haven't set up the contingencies appropriately to get more data collection. So how do we do that? How do we get there? I think so part of that is doing stuff like this. So I think that's part of how we get there. But I'll just jump into this because then I wanted to allow, I didn't want to stop. I'm already saying a lot more words than I needed to in throughout all of this. Well, Barbara and Annette, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that or
on that. I mean, just, well, I would say that, I look at least at a bare minimum in terms of data collection video. I mean, which is definitely something that, happens for me. But I'd say we're at least at that stage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we're getting closer to a point where we will start having the ability to use data to make assessments, to intervene. I think we're getting closer to that point within the animal training community. So, and part of that is going to be the technology. So what you already mentioned, the video, but then also, are there simple things? Do we have the apps on our phones that we can just sit there and hey, let me observe that, boom, 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 okay. Or let me impose this condition because this is what my app just told me to do, as opposed to that condition. Ideally, we should have things like that happening for functional analyses on our phones, like the ability to under natural. I mean, that's something that people like Greg Hanley have talked about at some level in terms of, so Dr. Greg Hanley, who does a lot of really cool stuff with functional analyses and functional behavior assessments, which is not, it does really cool stuff with talking about, and there are people that, my stipulation there, I was going to say, there are people that are, I'm a baby at this kind of stuff, especially Hanley's work. I have a few colleagues that worked with Greg Hanley that were doctoral students of his. One of my co-authors, Einar Ingvagerson, worked with Greg, was one of his doctoral students, and there's other people out there as well that do some of the stuff, but using non-contrived settings to do some of these functional analyses. That's some really cool stuff. So I think we'll get better at doing some of that stuff. I hope. We have to arrange the contingencies to make this.
It has to be easy. I mean, I think Annette would agree with us too. In the zoological community, there are so many barriers as it is for keepers to implement things like this, and those are your people that would have to implement it, to be quite honest. They're the ones who are at the forefront, who are going to see the behaviors on a regular basis, and probably the ones who are going to be implementing your interventions. And if they are not able to, easily track information, it's not going to happen.
Yep, and
absolutely right. It would be the least preferred thing they would do during a day. I mean, it's hard to make them even take notes from the training. So yeah.
It cannot be aversive. It cannot be. And we can, I can even teach some of the basics, or I and other people, we can teach them the basics of data collection. How do you do it, et cetera, et cetera. But if there aren't, that's not the barrier, right? So that's one of the barriers, but that's not the only barrier by any means. So even if suddenly, if I magically was able to make every dog consultant, every keeper, every person out there be familiar with how to collect data and do it perfectly.
I think you need to make it like, I think you need to make it like a computer game or something, when they typed in 5 behaviors, they get some, thing that they can buy more something lives or something. I don't know.
We need to, yeah, we need to arrange. I mean, it's not just the knowledge. The contingencies have to be in place for, how is this benefiting you? How is this directly benefiting the consultant? Were you better at designing a shaping program, an intervention program, because of data that you collected? If that doesn't exist, there's no reason to collect the data.
No, there's no reinforcer.
And because mostly, and again, as a consultant, mostly what people want, and I'm sure Annette experiences this too, is people just they just want the solution. They want the behavior fixed if it's a behavior problem, or they want to achieve the behavior goal as quickly and appropriately as possible. Obviously, using the appropriate procedures. So whatever. So sometimes if we, I think, understand the value in the data, but if it means delays to the result, that also sometimes is hard for those on the ground who just want to get to the result. So we have to, and sometimes it can take a while, to collect the data. And while that's happening, there's the behavior problem. If it's a problem is persisting, let's say we're talking about repetitive behaviors or something like that. And so, we have to address those situations too. So there's
sometimes we just need to get behavior fast. Like, we have 2 rhinos that needs to go to another zoo in 2 weeks, and we need to get them crate trained. I mean, we would use any, of course, in non-coercive way, but we would use any tricks to get them inside that crate, so we don't have to dart them and push them in there. So this is all about the goal.
And that should potentially be one of the things as well. Are there times when, let's not worry about the data in this instance? I would suspect yes, right? So, but those are empirical questions too. What I know is this, that we can't expect this to be a burden. We can't expect the data collection process to be a burden and then still, but you have to do it anyway. Those are terrible contingencies to set up.
And that's the same thing we think of as animal training consultants and coordinators. Like, we always think about that too. But, a lot of times keepers enjoy training, so they want to do it, but they are also have so many other responsibilities, and they can feel very pressured to have to do so many things. And so when I come into a facility as a consultant, I'm always aware of that. And how do I make it so that my presence hasn't been, because sometimes it's put upon them, whether they want it or not. Maybe they have all these other things that they're supposed to do that week, and now I'm put in front of them, and they've been told they have to work with me, and they're feeling the weight of the world on them because they have all these other things they have to do too. And so, you're always thinking about all those things where to me, training may be the most important thing, but it might not be the most important thing to them, or maybe they want it to be, but it can't be. I mean, there's so many factors. And so I get what you're saying there. It's like, how do we make it, we know it's a good thing, we know there's value in it, but how do we weigh and balance it against everything else and make it so that it can do what it can do? Same for me. Like, how can I be there and do what I can do for these people in a way that they are on board as well? So things to think about.
It's a very, I mean, that's already a battle just within the zoo community, aquarium community. There's that battle that's been being fought for several decades now about, hey, can we find a way to impose less aversive, specifically planned training procedures, so that that's part of why I wrote an article last year about saving time through training. So it was an article that I wrote with Peter Gilgem about, this is why we do this up front. right?
Sounds like an article I wrote a few years back. That's on my website.
Oh, well, that's I think it's a similar point that's been made time and time again, right? So this is the argument is, how do we get training to how do we invest up front so that we make it more likely that we don't have to spend time later on, right? How do we invest early on? So that's the benefit of training, I think, and we can make that argument. We have to have people see that connection, right? So they have to see that, hey, you know, by spending some time now training, then later on, we don't it's not terrible for the welfare of the animal. It doesn't cause harm to the animal when I have to catch, when you have to net the animal, all these problems there. But that's relevant as well, because this is an argument that has been made for multiple decades now in the training community. This is stuff that Molly Bloom-Smith has been arguing for the use of positive reinforcement. Gary Priest, Tim Sullivan, all these people within the zoo community. So Gail Lal has made this argument about why are we training to begin with, and I think that's important. But I think that's the next step, is data collection with that as well. So, do we dare jump into? I know Pablog. I don't know the EA blog. Pablog was asking about the LRS, and I don't know that we're gonna jump too far in. I mean, we don't have a ton of time. Like Barbara already mentioned, we could spend the next hour talking about the LRS. I guess we can introduce the concept and then just briefly mention some stuff about this, because this is something that did come up before on the Animal Reinforcement Forum, ARF, which is a Facebook group. What used to be, so it's a Facebook group that I run, used to be a listserv, started back in 2000-ish. Well, first off, what is that? The least LRS stands for the least reinforcing scenario, what used to be described as the least reinforcing stimulus. Barbara, you have any?
You know, Annette is far more qualified on this topic than I am, so I'm going to let her speak on this.
Yeah, I have a lot that I can say on this topic, and I want. That's why
I know, and it's a lot of pressure seeing Al Kadowski in here, because I know he's sitting on his tongue right now, and his arms is probably moving all around. And I know that he actually told me that you were reviewing the LRS, him and you, and there was something new coming up, because Al and I have actually been talking about this for about a year or something at least. I know that there's that you're working on what exactly is going on during an LRS. The only thing I can say from a practitioner's point of view is that I love the LRS, I use it, but I've also been aware of why some people don't like it. And that happened when I spoke to Bob Bailey at some point. And what I have heard is that people kind of, say that, oh, if I'm just doing an LRS, it's a least reinforcing scenario. When my animal is not doing the right behavior, it becomes kind of an excuse for poor training, or that it's okay to use it like 8 or 10 times during a session. And this is not at all how I have used it over the time. I mean, for me, and I wish I could see Al now, but for me, it's always been, knocking the window, knocking the glass solution, because it's, as I see it, if the animal that doesn't perform the behavior and you ask for behavior that the animal for some reason doesn't do, it's a trainer mistake. So, and I shouldn't be making mistakes all the time. So if I use an LRS 2 times in a session, I should go back and evaluate that session and say, well, why did I have to do that? Why am I animal not doing what I'm asking? So but it's a good way to get out of a situation which you shouldn't have been in the first place. But I think it's a good tool, and I will use it forever, no matter what you come up with, like if it's a timeout or if it's not a timeout or if it's on you know, whatever. I know that Al has a lot to say, and I know you have to, because I actually followed the discussion on Facebook. I think it's extremely interesting. I'm totally open to everything, and
yeah. So I'll back up just really quickly, talk about what happens. And there's a lot of variability here, so that's important too. And then what potentially is involved, because I think that's important. So historically, this was something really the LRS, or as I mentioned already, originally talked about as the least reinforcing stimulus, and then later described as the least reinforcing scenario. Really comes from the SeaWorld group, Al being one of the people there too, from SeaWorld, so from the Anheuser-Busch folk. So we're going several decades back, something that was used with cetaceans, although it's been used with a lot of different animals now, but originally used with dolphins, killer whales, etc., right? And the idea is this simple, regardless of the variability, because there's certainly a lot of variability in how it's applied, how the frequency it's applied, like what you just mentioned there, Annette, when it's applied. But nonetheless, the procedure seems to typically involve this, that there's some behavior that is less desired. Let's describe it simply as that the animal engages in. That behavior results in a typically 2 to 3 second, we can simply say a several second pause from the trainer, followed by then either a prompt or an acknowledgement of some other behavior, calm response, etc., something like that, that is then rewarded. So that, regardless of the variability, that seems to be the standard form of what happens. There's something that was undesired on the behavior of the animal by the trainer. The trainer stops the training for at least several seconds and then either prompts the next response or waits for something to occur that they want. So, and what I should add on top of that is that this procedure seems to be incredibly effective. So for people for what I've seen in how it's been implemented, and from the descriptions I've read, everything, all of that, when used, I don't want to say correctly, but certainly the people that the way that I've seen, because it's not always clear what is the correct way to use it, right? That's part of the debate, right? But nonetheless, it appears to be anecdotally very effective for getting animals back on track to training. Now, what's involved, we have to make some assumptions. So the assumption is that we are getting a decrease in the behavior that's disrupting the training procedure. And then we are getting an increase in this staying within these training conditions. As such, that if we can assume those two things, then that means essentially we have a treatment package. That's how I've described it. That first component is necessarily a negative punishment in the form of a timeout. You have removed, I mean, it meets all operational definitions of what Cooper, Heron, and Heward would describe as a non-exclusionary timeout, right? So the problem is that what people often think is a timeout is what they believe is the definition of a timeout is that it has to last for some extended period of time, which is not true. That's never the way that timeouts have been defined within the operant literature. Let me be clear about that, within the operant literature. And the second part is that people believe that you have to leave, when that is very clear that that is not a part of it. This is the reason why Cooper, Heron, and Heward talk about things like exclusionary versus non-exclusionary timeout. And that's something that Barbara and I have talked about. And Barbara even mentioned that as well in the animal reinforcement forum. So timeouts can be defined by just standing in place, but not allowing the animal to continue. In fact, that's part of the definition. So what's necessary is that there's a decrease in the behavior. Otherwise, then it would not be able to be defined as a timeout. But if you have this, the behavior that you are, that precedes the pause is decreasing in its frequency, that then the timeout was effective. That it is a timeout. You have used a punishment procedure. I won't get into the details of why that doesn't meet the definition of extinction, because I've talked about that elsewhere as well. But the other equally important part, and this is how people have typically advocated for the use of timeout or other effective uses of punishment within the applied behavior analytic community, is that it should be used infrequently and should be followed by some type of differential reinforcement procedure as well. You need to give the animal options, and many more options, for what will be rewarded. So regardless of what we want to talk about in terms of the ethics or any of that, that seems to be the most likely appropriate description of what's happening here. And I understand this all goes back to what we were mentioning earlier about what becomes far too, I think what people become critical about is they say, well, that's where they hear the word punishment. So Annette, similar to what you, and I agree with this point too, similar to what you were saying about some of the baggage involved. I have, while I am more so a fan, so there was some disagreement that I had with the terms positive and negative. I understand where you're coming from. I'm less of a fan of the term punishment to describe a decrease in behavior. It's there, it's part of our history. It's got almost 100 years of use just within the operant literature to be described that way, right? So we're going, it's 80 years, 80 plus years so being used to describe this reductive. Punishers as the consequence, and punishment is the contingency that produces a decrease in behavior, but it has baggage. And so people tend to not like to use that term to describe things. And I don't think that if all we're doing is adhering to, well, I hear the term punishment, I don't like it, so therefore it's not punishment what I use, that's neither true scientifically or probably not the best way to guide our ethics either. Because we can equally have, I think the LRS in many cases is an incredibly, the way that I've seen it used is an incredibly ethical, welfare-oriented practice. And
I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, by saying that a timeout and therefore negative punishment is involved doesn't suddenly make it unethical. That is a terrible way to guide our ethics, if we're going to say that we care more about the term that is used to describe some procedure than what is actually happening. All right, so I have gone off on way too many spiels here. So
I'm very quiet because I could. This is a hot topic, and we could, go on for hours. And I know if we let Al in, we will not, go to bed tonight because we can talk about this.
Yeah, Al is what Al and I, as you mentioned already, Al Kordowski, Al and I are looking at this document he's been involved in. We're trying to revise that at some point. Al, I need to get back to you on that too at some point. But Al and I have spent hours talking about this. Al's one of my amazing falconry trainer, and one of my favorite trainers to talk to on the planet, because we can have disagreements too, and we still both enjoy talking to each other while disagreeing with each other. Al's wonderful. Al's a fantastic trainer, and I'm far more on the academic side. So I'm really, that's what makes me so excited about this paper that we're producing. So that will, I think, cover a lot of aspects of the LRS. Hopefully, provide some resolution to this. So yeah.
Yeah, I have questions, but I don't dare starting up because it will have no end. So
right.
let's do it another day.
Yeah. I didn't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of the LRS, but that's, and there are certainly, and I think what's really important here too is this is my perspective on LRS and how I see that fit. Now, I think I'm biased towards my perspective, but that I think that's important that we all acknowledge that too. There's parts of it that I might be getting wrong. There's parts of it that I say we also need to know the effectiveness of how this works. There are people that would disagree with lots of things that I say, and that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's supposed to, this is part of my I think that's important part of my training too, but that's important. So what is necessary, I think, at some level, especially with the LRS discussion, is that we know where it fits within the already defined terminology and principles that do exist. So we make an argument for this, and that's something that I think is true within all of animal training and much of animal training procedures. It's very, I mean, we see this, it seems like almost every day somebody comes up with, they label a new procedure, they label a new intervention that they've come up with. Well, I call this, I call that. And there are some of these that I say, wait a second, but we already have a term to describe that. Or we already have a procedure to describe that. We already have this, we already have that. So I like to tie the literature where I can to that. I think that's important without being aversive. That's equally important. So, well, are there any other? I don't know. I feel like I mean, you all have been incredibly polite, both of you, in terms of you've let me get on way too many soapboxes. I'm usually better on as many soapboxes. But no, this has been. I don't know if there's any other. Is there anything we haven't covered from our points? What?
I feel like we hit our 3 points, didn't we?
Yeah, I think we did. We got into way more discussion of ethics than I was even expecting to jump into as well, which is awesome because we need to have more discussions about the ethics of animal training in general. Are there any other questions that people have? Because I think we're kind of coming to the end of our time.
We drew them all away. No, there's still a few that hung in there for us.
They fell asleep.
This was great. This was great. So yeah, well, I guess we'll probably end this here. So thanks to everybody who showed up for this. This was yeah. Well, thank you, Gabe. Gabe was just yeah. There's a lot of stuff. Thank you, Stephanie. And Soria. I think Barbara was asking this
I
before.
know she comes to our live streams, and I know I butcher your name. You're gonna have to get on here afterwards and turn on your microphone and tell us how to say your name so I say it correctly.
Yeah. Well, I will upload this video in not in a few days, within a couple or a few days. This was really great. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Annette, for doing this. We got into a lot of fun stuff. I got to talk about bears too. People normally only let me talk about penguins when we're going to talk about zoo animals. I'm like, let me talk about bears. I love
I'm sure we both could have gone much farther down the bear pathway. So we'll just have to do this again sometime.
Yeah, no kidding. So no, but this was awesome, and thank you everybody for attending. And thank you everybody out there in YouTube land.
And thank you, Eddie, for hosting this.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, it's great. I was thinking as you were saying this, that this has been one of the really wonderful things about the pandemic, if you can say that. But there's been so many really great learning opportunities virtually, and I know for me, especially last year and maybe the year before that, I feel like I've learned so much as a mature person in the animal training industry. But I really feel like, kind of a lot of growth in the last few years. And I would really encourage everybody to just keep that going in your life, sort of that open mind and open to new things that maybe, don't get stuck in your ruts. Don't get stuck in one kind of mindset about animal training, because our industry has a lot of growth to go through. I still think we're not done yet. And I feel like I've grown a lot this year, and I hope you all are continuing to grow. And especially thank you, Eddie, for doing this and giving us all another opportunity to keep moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is, well, everybody is very welcome. So awesome. All right. Bye.
Bye.